it's sort of like cloud computing in the sense that you may have all of your photographs, your videos, your files, your emails stored in the cloud. Everything, all the resources necessary to reconstruct your files are there in the cloud. So I think our cosmos is like that. It's a multi-level cosmos. Resources are there on the higher levels to, you could say, reboot our system when it periodically undergoes these catastrophes that take place.
Hello, my friends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Who are we and where do we come from? Those are two very pertinent questions that are just too rarely asked, but that we ask quite often on this channel. I'd like to introduce to you Michael Cremo. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Good to be with you, Anders, and all of your listeners and viewers.
So you're a known name in the quote-unquote alternate sphere of archaeology, I think you might call it. I think you can be labeled one of the modern pioneers in that field. You've written many books, but the first one, or the one that really, was was a big hit, was the 1993 book Forbidden Archaeology, which you wrote together with Richard Thompson, and it's been called an underground classic. But of course, there are many proponents of lost ancient civilizations out there. But you are perhaps the one who goes the farthest when it comes to what ancient actually means, because you claim that humans have lived on this planet for millions, if not hundreds of millions of years. And as far as I understand, you have reached that conclusion after having researched, among other things, also so-called out-of-place artifacts. So there are there are archaeological findings that are hidden from the public. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's kind of interesting, Anders. One of the reasons why I got into this whole topic of extreme human antiquity is an experience I had when I was 16 years old, living in Germany on an American military base with my father, who was a military officer. On my vacations, I would travel to different places in Europe. And one place I traveled to was Stockholm.
Oh,
and
really?
I was staying in the youth hostel there. And I met some European young people who had traveled overland to India from Europe and come back. And now they were in the youth hostel at Stockholm. So I talked to them, and they were telling me about their experiences in India, going to the Ganges River and the Himalayan mountains and Kashmir, and meeting different yogis and gurus and things like that. And I became fascinated. I wrote down exactly how they had gotten there and how they had gotten back. It wasn't by airplane. In those days, it was fairly easy to travel overland through the Middle East. It's a little more dangerous these days, but in those days, they were able to do it. And I became interested in Vedic culture of India. And eventually, I began to study the ancient Sanskrit writings the Puranas, especially the histories. And I was surprised to notice that they mentioned the presence of human beings, human populations, going much further back in time than our modern scientific understanding would allow or permit. And that got me looking into the history of archaeology. I began to wonder, well, is there any truth to what these ancient writings are saying, or is it just some mythology? So perhaps there's some physical evidence that would be consistent with that idea. When I looked in the current textbooks of archaeology and anthropology and history, I didn't see any such evidence. I saw only discoveries that supported the then dominant idea that human beings like us had first appeared less than 100,000 years ago. Of course, that's a few decades ago when I was starting this research. Now they say about 300,000 years.
Yeah,
certainly,
it's constantly being pushed back, that time frame. Homo sapiens.
Yeah, so I didn't find any such evidence in the current textbooks and scientific literature. But when I looked into the original reports from scientists, archaeologists, geologists, other scientists digging into the earth, I noticed that in the what I call the primary scientific literature of the past century or so, many scientists were reporting discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, and layers of rock, strata, that are far older than a few 100,000 years, in some cases, many millions of years. So that led me to a question. Well, why, if this evidence is there in the professional, scientific, peer-reviewed literature, why aren't these reports mentioned today? And
sorry, when did these reports come out? Are you talking about late 19th century or something like that? Early 20th?
Well, yeah, some of them are from that period. I did a historical survey of the history of archaeology, looking into all the reports, whether they were cited today or not. And I found that these reports were very common in the 19th century and early 20th century, but they continue to be made today. They're still being reported, but not being, they're interpreted in a certain way so that they fit in with the current ideas. For example, Mary Leakey in 1979, which is fairly late in the 20th century, found footprints at a place called Laetoli in the East African country of Tanzania. Or Tanzania, I'm not exactly sure how to properly pronounce the name. But she said in her original published reports, they're exactly like modern human footprints, and other scientists also agreed, but they couldn't attribute them to anatomically modern humans because, according to their standard way of looking at things, anatomically modern humans didn't exist at that time. So they proposed,
how old were those footprints, you said?
3,700,000 years.
Wow.
Yes.
I've heard about footprints in New Mexico recently discovered that are kind of footprints into it's into the bedrock, but it's not, of course, granite or anything, but was probably softer when humans walked there. But they are estimated to be, I think, 20,000 years old or something like that. But this is a completely different ball game.
Yeah, well, that would be at the limit of what most scientists today would consider the first human presence in North America. I mean, humans would have been existing in Asia and Africa and Europe even. But according to most scientists, the first humans didn't enter the Americas, North and South America, until fairly recently, within the past 20,000 or 25,000 years. But there have been many discoveries recorded in the scientific literature of evidence for a human presence going much further back in time than that. Now, the reason they're not mentioned very much today is what I would call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. And this is not a conspiracy theory, it's something that's very well understood by historians and philosophers of science, namely that theoretical preconceptions can influence how scientists will react to various categories of evidence that come to their attention. In other words, evidence that conforms to a dominant paradigm or a dominant consensus in a particular scientific discipline will pass through this social intellectual filter very easily. And that means you'll see it displayed in museums, you'll hear scientists talking about it at their professional gatherings. But if there's evidence that radically contradicts a dominant paradigm, this word paradigm was a word that was introduced by a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he pointed out that if evidence contradicts a dominant paradigm, it tends to be filtered out in the sense of, well, it's set aside. We'll get to that later. It doesn't fit right now. And if there's only
until it's overwhelming, until the evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah, well, or at least sufficient to raise some questions that can't be ignored. So, and that happens. There are if you look at the history of science, there have been revolutions in scientific disciplines when they're confronted with evidence that challenges their paradigm. So, of course, it's not that every anomaly winds up overturning a major scientific theory, but it does happen occasionally.
Yeah. So would you say that these anomalies are perhaps not actively suppressed? I mean, consciously suppressed. It's rather that the mainstream archaeologists simply can't take them in because, lest their paradigm, their worldview is shredded into pieces. That's more the explanation for why these are suppressed.
Or they don't have time.
Or they don't have time.
They're busy working on their current excavations, applying for grants, teaching, organizing scientific conferences. An anomaly that doesn't fit, they may not even be aware of it. If it is persistent and enough of them accumulate, then things may change. Of course, another option is having a plurality of theories. There are many archaeologists today who accept the idea that there can be many archaeologies. They tend to be the sort that believe that this one single archaeology that's now dominant, the Western physicalist, materialist, scientific, rationalist, objective science of archaeology is the only archaeology that can be practiced. But many archaeologists in Europe and other places believe that that archaeology was used to suppress and other worldviews based on other epistemological and ontological foundations during the colonial period. So, for example, the Journal of the World Archaeological Congress, which is one of the world's, probably is the world's largest international organization of archaeologists, their journal, their professional scientific journal, is called Archaeologies, plural.
Interesting.
They say in that journal, we're interested in receiving submissions based on non-Western epistemological principles. So that's perhaps one reason why I've been able to get a hearing in the professional archaeological circles, their institutes, their university courses, their international scientific conferences. I presented many papers at meetings of the European Association of Archaeologists, the World Archaeological Congress. And that means to me that at least some archaeologists, a good number of them, are willing to listen to alternatives. And I think if ideas are eventually going to change, that the first step is somebody has to be willing to listen to alternatives. Now, I'm not saying they agree with me entirely or in part, but they are willing to listen to make alternatives like the one I'm presenting as part of their discourse. And
That's
now there
hopeful.
are a lot of people who object to that from the archaeology singular group, but I'm just stating the facts as they've happened.
Yeah, well, it sounds hopeful anyway. Maybe things are happening, and we will talk a little bit more about that. But you mentioned these footprints in Tanzania there, 3 million plus years old. Homo sapiens, or anatomically modern human feet, apparently. What are some other of the most prominent smoking guns, if you will, that tell us that civilization, or humans or civilization, I mean, both, are much older than we are led to believe?
Yeah, well, one detail I was going to get to before I switched to another topic about the late Tolly footprints was that although Mary Leakey and the others who originally discovered them said they were like modern human footprints, one paleontologist said they're exactly like the footprints that you or I would make if we were walking on a sandy beach today. You couldn't distinguish them from our footprints. But they didn't attribute them to Homo sapiens because, according to their concept, Homo sapiens didn't exist until much later, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago, not 3,700,000 years ago. They said, well, there must have been some kind of hominid, some human ancestral creature who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how they were made. Now, that's an interesting proposal, but there wasn't any scientific evidence to back it up. Scientists had discovered foot bones of Australopithecus, who is the hominid that existed at that time, 3,700,000 years ago. And the foot structure of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. For example, the toes are long, and the first toe moves out to the side like a human thumb.
Much like the feet on modern big primates today, the other primates.
Yeah, chimpanzees, that sort of thing. So that is an example of what I have called knowledge filtration, where scientists are looking at evidence. It says, what it directly says is there's evidence, possible evidence, that humans like us were existing 3,700,000 years ago. If they were there, they'd make a footprint exactly like that. Now, somebody might say, well, that's a little ambiguous because maybe there was an Australopithecine type hominid that did have anatomically modern human-looking feet. And we'll find the evidence for it someday. Well, okay, they would say it would be better if you had human skeletal remains that could show the presence of human beings like that. Well, such things do happen, but it's more or less the same response. In 2016, a team of archaeologists working at Olduvai Gorge, which is in the same country, found a finger bone. Now, this may seem like a very minor discovery, but it's one of the smoking guns that you were talking about. The finger bone that they found was a fifth manual proximal phalanx. You know, your finger bones have three bones in them. The one nearest the palm of the hand is the proximal. And they took this finger bone and they carefully measured it. You know, they do dozens of measurements on it, feed it into a computer, and they do a statistical analysis, comparing it with the same bone in different species of modern primates, like the chimpanzees, the gorilla, all of them. And they also compared it with fossil hominid bones, the same bone from Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and so on. And they also compared it with a sample of the same finger bone from anatomically modern human populations. Now, they found, after doing their multivariate statistical analysis, that it fit squarely in the human group, the modern human group. Now, what they found it in layers of sediment that were dated as being 1,800,000 years old. So what they said in their published report was in Nature Communications, which is one of the top scientific
pretty big journal
for announcing current discoveries. So they said, well, this our analysis shows that this finger bone is the OH83 specimen. That's the official designation of it. Olduvai hominid 83, OH83. So they said this OH83 finger bone is most like that of modern Homo sapiens. But of course, we can't designate it as Homo sapiens because of its geological age. So they don't think that they're manipulating the interpretation of the evidence. They're trying to cover up something. They just think, well, it's anatomically modern human, but we know anatomically modern humans didn't exist at that time. So who was there? Some variety of Australopithecus or maybe Homo erectus. We don't know. We'll figure it out later. So that's another smoking gun. Now, I've been giving these fairly recent examples because one criticism of my work is that, well, that's an old discovery from the early 20th century or the late 19th century. But, scientific evidence doesn't have an expiration date on it. It's not like you buy some milk and after some time it automatically gets spoiled. If you look at a standard textbook of archaeology, it'll include many discoveries from the 19th century that are hailed as groundbreaking discoveries that set a foundation for our current work today. And,
and also one discipline, as far as I understand, is actually within archaeology is to revisit old findings from the 19th century, for instance, and study them again and analyze them again and find new details about them.
Yes, I think that's important. Once I was giving a talk on forbidden archaeology, that book of mine, at Free University in Amsterdam. And my audience was graduate students of paleontology, archaeology, and geology. And in explaining this body of evidence that's been filtered out, I made the point to them that you should be aware of the full data set that's related to your field of study. And I will let you divide that data set up into different categories. That this seems fairly certain. This may be true. This is too far out to fit in anything that we understand at the present moment. But keep the entire data set in view, because in light of future discoveries, something that doesn't make sense at the current moment may be an important piece of the puzzle that does make sense in light of newer discoveries.
Yeah, I come to think of the drill core number 7 that was found by archaeologist Flinders Petrie in Egypt in the 19th century. And I'm sure you're aware of Christopher Dunn, engineer originally, who has been, he's an independent researcher in this area now, and he's been reanalyzing this drill core to find and he's found evidence that it's a spiral groove around it, which means that some kind of machinery has been used to extract that drill core. This is just an example that I came up with. It's just very interesting because that's been sitting in a museum for decades. So you said before that many of these archaeologists that kind of dismiss anomalies that people like you and others find out there because they sometimes aren't even aware that they exist. They aren't aware of that there are alternative archaeologies, so to speak. But in this day and age, we have all this information, all these means, channels of communication, and all these independent researchers that have been that are studying this, and there are so many YouTube channels, as you know, covering this topic, and also I think in some brave mainstream mass media, you can see reports of alternative findings around these things. For instance, Graham Hancock is a known name, and he even has a documentary series on Netflix. So, what do you think of all these other ancient civilization hunters out there, if you might call them that, and the recent craze around the topic? Is this a good thing, or does it create confusion?
Well, I think it's actually a good thing. Yeah, alternative archaeology is a big field, and there are lots of different areas of research. Sometimes we deal with different parts of the time spectrum. I would say Graham Hancock is operating in the period of about the past 50,000 years or so, and especially now looking into evidence for civilizations that existed during the a certain geological time period that goes back about 20,000 years, the Younger Dryas. So that kind of challenges modern ideas that civilization began to develop only about 6 or 7,000 years ago. Although we're working in different areas and may not agree with everything each other says, we are aware of each other's work. For example, Graham Hancock wrote a very nice foreword to my book, The Hidden History of the Human Race, and which he called that sort of work of mine one of the landmark intellectual achievements of the late 20th century. So, and I think he's doing really great work. I guess one of the proofs of that is that the Society for American Archaeology has put out a protest about his series on Netflix.
Yeah,
So,
and not only them, many others also.
yeah, I do a lot of archival research looking into out of print scientific reports and going into museums and looking at old collections and visiting sites of some of these early exponents of archaeology worked at. So that's the sort of thing I do. Others are now using uh, technologies such as Google Earth to scan the oceans and the land surfaces of the continents for archaeological evidence of ancient civilizations. So there's a lot going on. And I suppose it depends upon what audience you're trying to convince. If you're just trying to entertain people, and that's one thing. But I try to reach out to a lot of different audiences, including the mainstream scientific audience, because I think in our world today, we're undergoing, whether you recognize it or not, really a fundamental renegotiation of our whole concept of uh, who we are and where we should be going. Those questions that you posed in the beginning of the show here. So I think there are a lot of parties to that negotiation. The alternative archaeologists are certainly part of it. The mainstream archaeologists and scientists are part of it. There are different, what we might call new age or spiritually inclined people who are thinking about these things. And then there's your kind of general informed public. And there are, I think, a lot of parties to this negotiation, and I try to stay in touch with all of them. What I would say is that one should be transparent about what one's own theoretical outlook is and try to be aware of the assumptions and commitments that potential sources of information that you're using to inform yourself and others, that there's transparency about what's motivating that.
Speaking of your outlook, let's circle back a little bit to what you mentioned in the beginning here, namely your connection with India and the Vedic tradition and the Vedic texts. I understand that you describe yourself as a Vedic creationist. Is that correct? And if so, how would you define that?
Well, I didn't define myself as that. There was a geo-archaeologist who reviewed Forbidden Archaeology when it came out. And he said, I've never seen a book like this before. It appears to be some kind of creationist literature, but it's not the usual kind we're familiar with. For one thing, this is very well researched, it's very well written, it's very well documented. It must be, something else. We could call it Krishna creationism or Vedic creationism. And I said, well, whatever they want to call me, I'll accept it. But really, I'm not a creationist in this sense. Although I do believe that we exist in a consciousness-based universe, I don't think it's a cosmic accident. I think there is some purpose to it for why it was manifested, and but I believe that it wasn't. I mean, that it undergoes the creation. Let's just say the cosmos. I'm not going to say creation. The cosmos that we exist in goes through cycles of manifestation and unmanifestation, and those cycles go on eternally.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's no creation. There's a happening that kind of
an ongoing event, never-ending event.
An ongoing event. And part of that ongoing event is the presence of human beings. And the human beings are present, I believe, because it's in the human bodily vehicle that a conscious self can come to understand the real answers to the questions, who am I? I would say the answer to that question is, I'm a being of pure consciousness. I'm not a robot vehicle made of molecules, molecular machinery. I'm something apart from that, a being of pure consciousness. Where am I? Well, I'm not in the place where consciousness can display its full potential. I'm somewhere apart from that. And where should I be going? I should be qualifying myself to go to the place where consciousness is not subjected to the limitations that are imposed on it in this section of reality. So to me, if that is true, then I would expect the human bodily vehicle to have always been available to conscious selves that are interested in coming to the proper answers to those fundamental questions. Who am I? Where am I? Where should I be going?
Okay, so I totally agree when you say that consciousness is primary, or that's what you're indicating, at least.
Yes.
Absolutely. But so what do the Vedic texts, the Vedic tradition tell us about these cycles, and what has transpired on this planet millions and millions of years ago? Many times have there been high civilizations that have collapsed, and then after that, other high civilizations that have collapsed? Have they fought wars with each other? Are there, would we be able to find remnants of these very, very ancient civilizations deep down underneath the surface of the earth if we looked for it, because of the geological cataclysms that have happened in between these different civilizations? Or what is it? What can you learn from those texts?
The answer to all of your questions is yes.
Okay.
All
Okay, fascinating.
Yeah. Well, people tend to want simple explanations of things. Yeah, they tend to want a simple materialist, physicalist, Darwinian, evolutionary explanation of things. There was a big bang. It resulted in the production of, well, first of all, space-time, and then simple gases, which helium and hydrogen, which accumulate together under the forces of gravity and eventually ignite, produce new generations of stars that forge the heavier elements that combine together, clump together to form planets around the suns, and there's water on some of them, and in that water, chemical elements naturally combine together to form some first single-celled creature that begins clumping together with other single-celled creatures to produce multicellular organisms, which gradually evolve into human beings. So that simple evolutionary linear account is favored by many people. And some people like a simple creation account. There's God who creates everything, creates the heavens and the earth, and then creates the animals, and then creates Adam and Eve, or whoever the first humans are, and things go on from there. Or some people like a simple extraterrestrial type of concept that things went on pretty much as the physicalists, materialists say, until the point of the hominid Homo erectus, when there were some extraterrestrials who came to the planet and manipulated.
The famous Anunnaki.
Yes. So, but actually, the real situation may be a little more complex, involving threads of all of those things woven into a very beautiful and complex tapestry, and where there is some overall guiding intelligence. There are some extraterrestrial beings that have something to do with our existence on this planet. And yes, there is a kind of evolutionary process that goes on, but not exactly the type that Darwin envisioned, more of an evolution of consciousness. And that all takes place in the course of cyclical time. So yes, there have been civilizations that have risen and fallen many times in the long history of the cosmos. And this view has been around for a long time. Aristotle and Plato spoke about it, that yes, there have been civilizations have risen and fallen, many, many times. Even though the civilizations may fall in the course of cyclical time, there may be periodic devastations. Science would call them extinction events that take place on our level of reality. it's sort of like cloud computing in the sense that you may have all of your photographs, your videos, your files, your emails stored in the cloud. So if your device, your smartphone or your tablet or computer gets destroyed, well, everything, all the resources necessary to reconstruct your files are there in the cloud, so you can download them on a new device. So I think our cosmos is like that. It's a multi-level cosmos, and the resources are there on the higher levels to, you could say, reboot our system when it periodically undergoes these catastrophes that take place.
So the cloud, is that equivalent to what I think the Hindu tradition calls the Akashic records?
Yes, something like that. There are different kinds of matter. Even modern astrophysics has come around to this idea that in addition to ordinary matter, the chemical elements in the periodic table, there are more subtle forms of matter that contribute to the exact kind of order and complexity we observe in our present cosmos, which can't be explained without positing these things like dark energy, dark matter. I think that was a fundamental development in the whole history of science, especially in the West, where the tendency since classical times, the time of the Greeks and Romans, the tendency has been to reduce the number of substances in the cosmos. Like if you go back to the time of Aristotle, they had the idea of different vital energies and forces existing at different levels of the cosmos. And they began gradually eliminating them until finally you're left with only gross physical matter of the ordinary type. So this development over the past several decades, where physicists, which is considered to be the hardest of sciences and the foundation of all of them, the astrophysicists have been introducing these new substances in order to explain what they actually observe. So I think that we need to do the same thing in order to explain what we observe in terms of different, what are called paranormal phenomena. And beyond that, the whole concept of consciousness. If we're going to actually explain these things, we're going to have to introduce or reintroduce into our picture of scientific reality these other elements.
I think you're right there. So, Michael, is the most problematic falsehood that we're being fed, would you say, that human evolution is linear when it's actually, in fact, cyclical? Is that, or cyclical, maybe you pronounce that, is that the biggest problem?
Well, that's one of them. I think the biggest problem is not understanding that consciousness is something different than the brain. Because, one of the implications of forbidden archaeology is we need new explanations for human origins. That's one thing that's clear, and that was written directly to me by one of the architects of the modern theories of human evolution, William Howells, who was a Harvard University physical anthropologist. And he wrote to me when he read Forbidden Archaeology when it first came out. He says, if this type of evidence is to be accepted, then it really calls into question not only our picture of human evolution, but the whole evolutionary picture of life on this planet. And that requires some sort of explanation. In other words, some alternative theory. Another prominent scientist, geoarchaeologist, wrote in his review, when you deconstruct a dominant paradigm, you have to put something in its place. And ordinary people would write to me, okay, you have all of this evidence, all these stones and bones that contradict the current theories of human origins. Well, if we didn't evolve it from the apes, where did we come from? So my answer to that question was a book that I wrote called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And what I started out in that, what I started that book by saying is, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from? We should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now, as I mentioned previously, today most scientists would say, well, you're a machine made of molecules, and that's all there is to it. And as far as consciousness goes, well, that's just a temporary byproduct of the neurons firing in the brain. When they reach a certain level of complexity, they generate consciousness, but only temporarily. At the time of death, when the chemicals in the brain become disorganized and the neurons are no longer firing, there's no consciousness. It's all finished. So I would say no. I think a human being is something more than a machine made of molecules. There's a subtle mental energy that's associated with the human organism that has some very unusual powers. It's able to act in ways that the ordinary laws of physics can't explain. And beyond that, there's the conscious self, which is not produced by matter, rather it exists independently from matter, and there's a lot of scientific evidence for that in the form of out-of-body experiences, past life memories, and other phenomena. So you go from the stones and bones, it leads to things that are related to mind and consciousness.
And this should all perhaps be integrated in the subject of archaeology and many other disciplines.
Yes, it should be archaeology of consciousness. Actually, the original intention that Richard and Thompson and I had was to make it all part of one book. But as kind of we got into the archaeological evidence, originally we thought we might find a few anomalies, maybe do 8 weeks of research, write it up, make it a chapter in the book. But as we got into following the evidence, one case led to another, and the 8 weeks turned into 8 months, turned into 8 years. As I said, my original plan, Richard was also agreeing about this, was that the alternative, the consciousness-based alternative, should be part of the original book. But I'm actually quite satisfied that we eventually wound up that I eventually wound up making it 2 books, because in that way, people become free to come up with their own explanation about what should be replacing the current understanding of human evolution. In other words, we've got this evidence that contradicts the current theories. We don't give our alternative. We let people think what their alternative would be, and people would write to me with their suggested alternatives. Maybe they say, well, maybe it was extraterrestrials that left some of these ancient objects, or maybe time travelers, coming from one era, going back into distant ages, left them, or maybe the materialistic process of evolution took place earlier than we now think possible. And, or maybe, like me, they would say, well, maybe there were ancient civilizations that, or human populations that existed in the distant past. But I thought that was a healthy thing, just present the evidence in forbidden archaeology that contradicts the current theories, and leave it to readers to come up with alternatives. So in the current context, it's necessary for someone to be knowledgeable about a lot of different disciplines, because one thing is tied to another. You see these theories, the materialistic physicalist theories, kind of interlock with each other, and that if you're going to propose an alternative to one, it involves presenting alternatives to all of them. But so in one sense, you do have to kind of be like a Renaissance person.
Yeah, one thing that I've pondered myself and that you point out somewhere is kind of funny, because it's that the fact that standard archaeology follows the linear Judeo-Christian time frame and concept of history. I mean, most scientists, you've been touching on this, that most scientists today, in the Western world at least, they pride themselves on being secular, and they would never admit to being stuck in a kind of framework created by the Abrahamic religions, but yet they are, because the textbook beginning of civilization happens to coincide with the time frame of the Bible for the beginning of the world. Isn't that correct? It's like 6,000 years ago.
Yeah. Actually, you're talking about a paper that I wrote called Puranic Time and the Archaeological Record. The time concept of modern science, which is linear and progressive, is derived ultimately from the cosmology of the Judeo-Christian culture in which modern Western science arose. And although they later came to try to step away from certain aspects of that Judeo-Christian cosmology, one thing they didn't reject, and which they kept, and it became a foundational part of their scientific worldview, was this linear, progressive time concept. In the original Judeo-Christian context, it is expressed in the terms of there's an initial creation event, and then God manifests the earth, and then manifests the plants, and then the animals, and then human beings. And human beings originally exist in a simple, natural state, but then they become involved in difficulties. They become fallen in the biblical sense, and then they have to be delivered by Christ in the Christian part of the concept. And then there's some final judgment, and human beings are saved. There's a salvation event, a final judgment, and some of them become saved and eternally exist with God. And then it's all over. It just happens once. And when I look at the modern scientific account, it preserves that linear, progressive sense of time.
Yeah, it actually is very similar to the biblical story, bar the time frame. I mean, the Bible talks about God creating the world in 7 days or something like that, but that could be just metaphorical, of course. But this thing that they coincide in the 6,000 year time frame when it comes to, I mean, modern science saying that civilization started then, and the Bible says the world started then. So that's kind of funny, I think.
Yeah, that is one element of it. But the larger element of it is there's a creation event in the form of the Big Bang. And many astrophysicists and scientists didn't like the Big Bang theory when it was first presented because they could see that means there was something before it. It becomes kind of a creation ex nihilo event that parallels God creating the universe. And then they follow this linear progressive idea of the universe is manifested with stars and the planets, the heavens and the earth. And then life is introduced, starting with the plants and the animals, and then finally the human beings are created or manifested by the Darwinian evolutionary process. And from there, humans become fallen, in terms of their social and economic development and diseases and things like that. And they have to be delivered or saved by science in this case. And then finally, some of them will be delivered. You have in science this idea that you can upload yourself into some computer or cryogenics, freeze yourself into a state where you'll eventually be derived. And
it's interesting. Yeah, they're actually very similar, as you say, and they're both in a way creationist stories, but the scientific one has a longer time span. But in the Vedic tradition, do they talk about anything that could be interpreted as some kind of a Big Bang beginning, or is it more like it's as we said before, it's one big event and it's just cyclical, and it's just because I've been pondering this Big Bang thing myself, and I've been thinking that, I mean, it looks as if there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago when you measure it, when you calculate things, given certain assumptions, of course. But I mean, nobody was there. We don't know. Maybe there was. Maybe the universe has always been there. So, what are your thoughts on that? And what do the Vedic texts say about this origin?
Well, they say that it's kind of interesting because they present things in a way that we're no longer familiar with thinking and expressing things. Of course, if you go way back in history, we'll see some commonalities, say, between ancient Norse ideas or the Greek and Roman ideas or the Egyptian ideas. they express things in a similar way. But the Vedic idea is that there is a being, a manifestation of God called Mahavishnu, who is lying in an ocean in a state of trance, and he's breathing in and out. When he breathes out, millions of universes expand from very small points to large size, and they remain in existence until he breathes in again, and then they contract. Now, there are interesting parallels with recent developments in astrophysics, where we have in the past few decades this idea of expanding universes. The term Big Bang was originally a derogatory remark made by supporters of the idea that the universe is in a steady state. It always exists. There's one universe. It exists in a steady state, just forever existing. So they didn't like very much this Big Bang idea that from a singularity, from an extremely dense, extremely condensed, extremely small, superheated, supermassive singularity, that the universe suddenly expanded. They say, oh, it's like a Big Bang. And they meant it in a negative sense, but it became adopted as the popular name of the theory. But it's also there in the Vedic concept that universes, they start out small, tiny, they're energized, and they expand. And then they contract. And that is a development that happened with the original Big Bang theory, which just involved one universe, expanding. I'm going to have to take a sip of water.
Sure. Absolutely.
So, and that's also there in the original Big Bang theory, which just involved one universe expanding from a singularity. And then they decided, well, what's going to happen with it? Is it going to just continue expanding? Is it going to expand to a certain level and then just continue on at that level? Or is it going to contract again? And they decided, many of them, a good many of them, they favored the idea that when you look at the physical forces, the strength of gravity, the mass of the universe, it appears that at a certain point, things are going to cease expanding and then they're going to start contracting again. And then what happened? Some of them said, well, then there's a big bounce. It expands again. So
in that sense, the modern science corresponds with the kind of the breathing that the Vedic tradition is talking about.
Yeah, that the universes expand and they contract. And then the next development was the multiverse idea, the idea that there's more than one universe, that there are many universes. That's considered a speculative idea in modern science because we have no direct access to those other universes. But some astrophysicists say we can detect signs of the gravitation of those other universes kind of affecting the, you could say, the bubble or membrane of our own universe. But it remains a speculative idea, but that idea is also there in the Vedic account, that there are many universes that emerge in the course of the breathing of Mahavishnu, they're all expanding to a certain point, and then when he breathes in, they're contracting. So it's kind of interesting that those sorts of parallels are there.
Yes,
And
yes, it is. Are we living in crucial times now? Are we going to understand our deep history, our true history, in the near future? And if so, if these are crucial times, were they foretold perhaps by the Vedic texts?
um, well, every time is a crucial time because
yeah, it's cyclical. Sorry, I forgot about that. But maybe this is one of the crucial points, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, there are, according to the Vedic cosmology, there are cycles within cycles within cycles, and at different points in these cycles, things are either more favorable or less favorable for understanding the answers to those fundamental questions which you raise. Who am I and where should I be going? Which also means, I would say, understanding where I am right now. Am I in the right place? So so we are at a crucial time. According to the Vedic cosmology, there is a cycle of 4 ages, which can be compared to the seasonal cycle that we undergo in the temperate latitude countries of spring, summer, fall, and winter. And during those times, we wear different clothes, we eat different foods, play different sports. We're familiar with that seasonal cycle. So the first season in the cycle of what are called yugas is a golden age where everything is very simple, very natural, very spiritual. People are not involved in conflict with each other. They're able to have whatever they need to live very simply, naturally, and peacefully. And it's an age in which everyone is engaged in meditation, yoga, contemplation, trying to develop their consciousness. In the next age, things deteriorate a little bit. People begin dividing themselves up into different classes. They begin to live in different areas with different levels of comfort. They become a little competitive with each other instead of cooperative. And then in the next stage, things break into open warfare and conflict. But it's kind of conducted, the warfare is conducted according to certain principles. Like in medieval Europe, they had the concept of knights, who fought with each other, but according to certain civilized rules. But now we're in the 4th age, which kind of corresponds to the winter season, which is predicted to be an age of increasing social and environmental disturbance, according to the Vedic text.
And when did that start? Sorry, when did that start, according to the calculations that you've been making?
About 5,000 years ago, and it will continue for another 427,000 years. And I think in those 5,000 years, we can see that things are becoming a little more disturbed socially, politically, economically, and in terms of the environment as well.
So that's a little
So,
bit more pessimistic than those who speak about, you know, a new Aquarian age, for instance, where humanity is going to ascend in a way or achieve a higher consciousness.
well, according to the particular school of thought that I'm following, even when winter is coming, you know, things are getting colder. The general trend is things get colder, but we may experience a few days or a week where things get warm again, and then it goes into a really hard winter. So, according to the tradition that I'm following, at the present moment, we are in one of those periods that goes against the trend. The trend is towards more disturbance. But beginning about 500 years ago, there began a 10,000 year period where, although the trend of the age is downward, things go up for a little bit. But then after that 10,000 years, things rapidly go downhill.
And the whole winter period is, what did you say, 500,000 years or something like that?
432,000 years, 5,000 years, which have passed. So eventually there'll be, you know, just like after winter, there's spring again, and then a summer, and then, you know, so and we have to be prepared for. So it is a crucial time, but it's always a crucial time in the sense that.
I understand. So this has been so fascinating. I mean, we could speak for hours, I guess, but maybe we can do it again someday.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah. There are more questions to ask around this, of course. I mean, who are we? Where do we come from? And where are we going? The big questions that we like to ask on this channel. So, Michael Cremo, where can people go to find out more about your fascinating work and yourself?
Well, a good place to start would be my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. And I also have a public figure Facebook page, Michael Cremo, It's Really Me. I put that on many years ago because I noticed somebody else had a website, or not a website, but a Facebook page or some social media page that claimed to be me but wasn't.
That's so annoying. Yeah, some people.
I don't know. Yeah, so kind of as a joke, I said, Michael Cremo, It's Really Me. But that's the name of my Facebook public figure.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll put links in the description box below, as always. So, Michael Cremo, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest on Mind the Shift, and good luck with your important endeavor.
Yeah, we have to keep shifting minds.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution to that.